Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ELPC Thinks. I'm Howard Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. And ELPC Thinks is where we bring together political leaders, environmental leaders, experts, community partners to talk about new strategies for progress and how we get things done, in this case, better protecting and restoring the Great Lakes. Quick heads up. We're recording this webinar. It will stream live on Facebook so that you and everybody else can share it with friends and folks who couldn't join today. So let me welcome Illinois State Senator Laura Fine and Member of Provincial Parliament from Ontario, Jennifer French. Laura and Jennifer will talk with us about how legislators work together across lakes, across borders, and across the aisle as members of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus. You may hear me refer to GLCC or the Caucus. That's the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus, which is a mouthful to try to say. It's a nonpartisan binational organization of state and provincial legislators from the Great Lakes Basin who work together to protect the region. And it's housed out of our good colleagues at the Council of State Government's Midwest office. And you'll be hearing from Jess Leinhardt from the Council of State Government. So if you have a question, please click the Q&A icon on your screen, type in your question. And after we hear some conversation with Jennifer French and Laura Fine, and we'll try to open it up for some Q&A with people. So let's begin. Let me introduce our panel. You'll hear more about the Great Lakes Caucus. We'll have a discussion and then address some questions. So Illinois State Senator Laura Fine represents Chicago's northern suburbs. Laura's been a state senator since 2019 and served as a state representative for 6 years before then. She serves on the Illinois State Senate Environment and Conservation Committee, has been a member of the caucus since 2013, and is currently the vice chair. MPP Jennifer French was first elected as a member of provincial parliament for Oshawa, Ontario, about 10 years ago in June of 2014. And Jennifer's been a member of the caucus since 2018 and serves as Ontario's representative to the executive committee. She's also the vice chair of their task force on climate resiliency, previously served on the task force on nutrient management, and MPP French serves the legislature as the chair of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, and as the critic. That's a term that means a lot different in Canada than it does in the States for infrastructure, transportation, and highways. So let me turn it over for a moment to Jess Leinhardt. Jess is the Great Lakes Program Director for the Council of State Governments Midwest. Jess, take it away.
Thank you, Howard. I'm going to quickly share my screen for a few slides. You should see them there. So hello, everyone. I am Jess Leinhardt. I am the director of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus, or GLLC. And I'm just going to provide a very brief overview of our organization to begin the conversation. We were founded by the late Michigan Senator Patty Burkholz in the early 2000s. Senator Burkholz noted that while Great Lakes protection and restoration work was governed by a number of binational agreements like the Boundary Waters Treaty or the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, there was not a particular forum for education and engagement for state and provincial legislators. The early meetings of the GLLC took place on the margins of the Midwestern Legislative Conference, but now the group has evolved into an active caucus with membership from the 8 states and 2 provinces that you see on your screen. The GLLC is dedicated to building relationships between legislators, creating a space for nonpartisan discussion, and sharing best policy practices where it comes to the Great Lakes. Caucus activities are supported by the Council of State Governments Midwest, which is my office, the Joyce Foundation, the Mott Foundation, the Wegge Foundation, as well as others. And we maintain 5 policy priorities, which are the 5 areas that are listed on your screen. And these policy priorities were affirmed by our membership just last year. To further our policy priorities, we bring our members together every year for an annual meeting to learn and make decisions together. And outside of annual meetings, every 2 years, the executive committee picks a focus for intensive policy study, which is the biennial Burkholz Institute. The executive committee holds an application process and selects a number of Burkholz fellows from across the region that come together and study and develop policy recommendations together. In addition, we also hold web meetings throughout the year to provide education and update members on any caucus activities. We also submit sign-on letters on issues and pass resolutions in order to take and communicate positions on a number of Great Lakes issues. And then every 2 years, the GLLC task forces bring policy recommendations forward for adoption by the general membership. Policy recommendations go a step farther than our policy priorities, which outlines active programs and best practices throughout the region in a particular area. So far, we've adopted recommendations on lead in drinking water, nutrient management, and recommendations on climate resiliency are going to come before the membership this September. We also track legislation that is being introduced across our states and provinces. This tracker is publicly available on our website if you're interested. And already this biennium, we've been tracking over 600 pieces of legislation. And this visual just kind of shows you how the activity in legislation varies for our policy areas, so we can see where most of our members are looking. And I also want to mention that while we are particularly focused on state and provincial legislators, we actively seek partnerships and engagement with other Great Lakes organizations. The GLLC is an observer of the Great Lakes Executive Committee and the Great Lakes Commission. We serve on the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, Mayor's Commission on Coastal Resilience. We are a knowledge partner of the Council of Great Lakes Region. And we are pleased to be working with the Great Lakes St. Lawrence governors and premiers to make our 2024 annual meeting a Great Lakes Green event. So I know that was a very quick overview, but I just wanted to give a starting point for this conversation and turn things over to the legislators to talk even more about the caucus and their experience. Thank you, Howard.
You're welcome. So let's just talk a little bit, Senator Fine and MPP French, about how are you engaged in the caucus? I mean, there are lots of caucuses, there are lots of things you get asked to do, there are lots of committees, there are lots of caucuses in Parliament, in the state legislature. How did you get engaged in the caucus, and what are some of the differences on US and Canadian perspectives, priorities, and policies? Tell you what, why don't we start, Senator Fine, with you, home state of Illinois.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having us here today and spreading the word about the caucus. I think in some circles, we are the best kept secret because we are a group of legislators, bicameral, bipartisan, across federal lines that really have an interest in how do we preserve our fresh water and our Great Lakes. And for me, because my district runs along Lake Michigan, when I was first elected and joined the Environmental Committee, joined the Green Caucus in the Illinois legislature, started learning about the Council of State Governments and found out that they have this organization that focuses on something that's so important to me, I could not help but get involved. And as a result of it, I have learned so much. And I feel like our caucus has worked together so hard to really make keeping our lakes fresh and clean and sustainable has come a long way with all that we've done.
MPP French.
Sure thing. It's interesting because I did not find this caucus myself. I had the opportunity to be invited. The way that it has worked since the beginning of the caucus with Ontario is that it has been traditionally the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly in their nonpartisan capacity has been invited to participate in this. And when I started, I was not the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, but I was on that supporting team of kind of deputy speakers. And the Speaker of the House said, is there someone else who's interested, and invited me because I live on Lake Ontario. I have the opportunity to actually peek out of my third floor townhouse bedroom and see the lake, which is fun. But I was invited to participate, and I had no idea that it would tick all of my personal investment boxes. I'm a science nerd. You know, I draw from a background in biology, which does not make me good at this or an expert, but it does make me quite interested in the weeds, so to speak, which is sometimes where we land with all of the information that we gather.
And the science background probably better informs your thinking.
I don't know about that. I don't remember paying that much attention during my undergraduate work, but I pronounce things, with confidence. So not to diminish that, but it wasn't a prerequisite, right? And it was just an opportunity to be a part of this caucus. It was a good fit for me personally, and as a legislator along, in a Great Lakes community. Of course, I have an interest as a representative as well as a super nerd. So I have continued since 2018 and have had the opportunity to serve on the executive each of the 2-year terms. And I have been a continuous part for Ontario. So for a while, we were the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, and then we rebranded and involved the St. Lawrence, because of course, there's not really borders there where water flows. And that allowed us to invite and include folks from Quebec. So sometimes it's me when it's at the executive table, but at all of our annual meetings and webinars, we pull from all parties in our legislature, have the opportunity to participate. So you had asked also about the differences between the Canadian and US perspectives.
Yeah, I think particularly for most of the people who are on this webinar are from the States. And I think there's a lot of interest in better understanding, the similarities in the way that our Great Lakes colleagues from Canada think about protecting and preserving the Great Lakes, and the ways in which the perspective may be a little bit different.
Well, I'm going to start that one, and then Senator Fine, if you want to kind of round it out. I don't know that I see a difference nationally speaking in terms of mindset. I think it depends on, on the background. Like when I had first joined not to make this partisan, but when I first joined the caucus, I didn't know the political stripes of, my American counterparts. And it was an interesting one to guess. You could Google them and find out, but it depended, were people coming from that kind of landowner or recreational use of the Great Lakes as that driving force that brought them there, connections to industry and major water users, some folks who have served in municipal government levels that have dealt with zebra mussels clogging up the pipes and diminishing their water sources. It's less partisan or less national, I would say. It's kind of our interest. Is it an ecological and environmental lens? Is it a matter of, saving? Like, we all have interest in the Great Lakes. Some folks it's sport fishing, and others it is reducing the harm that's happening with erosion. And so it's individual, and I think it's a connection to our communities. The one thing I'll say that is a national difference is every time my American counterparts are talking about funding, I just sort of like, this is interesting, because there are different challenges, there are different opportunities. Funding, you can't compare those opportunities or realities at all. And some of the sign-on letters, I wouldn't have the authority to sign on behalf of Ontario or on behalf of my jurisdiction. And so there are some of those more political strings that we have to think about and sometimes pull or not. But that's where I see a bit of the difference between Canada and the US.
Thank you. Laura, what's your thinking on that? Talk a little bit about it.
Sure. So I think what's most fascinating about the caucus and members of the caucus is the fact that we do come from 8 different states and 2 different provinces, but we all have the commonality of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence because everything is connected. So no matter what happens in Canada or what happens in the United States in Illinois or Indiana or Michigan, it's going to affect everybody because nothing can be separated. So issues that we might focus on, let's say in Illinois, for example, I just passed a piece of legislation last year to that prohibits the use of the small plastic bottles in hotels and motels throughout the state. And that's going to keep thousands of pounds of plastic out of the water. And that's great that Illinois is doing their part, but how fabulous that I can communicate with my partners in other states and in Canada about what we've been able to accomplish here so that they could take the ball and run and pass similar legislation in their states, and we can even make a greater difference. So I think a lot of it is the ripple effect and finding out what's being done in the provinces in Canada to protect our lakes that we can possibly replicate here in the United States. Or what are some of the issues that are happening in Minnesota that we can do in Illinois? So we could really work collaboratively towards one goal. Because, like I said earlier, everybody who's participating in the caucus, we have that same singular goal. And this gives us the opportunity to have more fingers in the pot to make sure we can get that done.
You know, I see where you're going in terms of the collaboration, innovate and replicate on the plastic bottle issue, which is a great opportunity. If the both of you could talk a little bit about just what are 1 or 2 specific examples of where the caucus has worked with bipartisan legislators from both sides of the border and has actually moved forward, a policy development or another connection that drove a policy outcome. Are there a couple of good examples of that you can highlight?
Well, maybe I'll start there. It is very interesting to take the field trips, I'll call them. When we have in-person meetings and the annual meetings, had the opportunity to go to Chicago or go to Detroit, Quebec City. We've had opportunities to go and see good ideas in action. That they're well organized so that we can see best practice. If we're on a farm and we're learning about nutrient management and we're seeing government policies in action that the farms can sign on, get that kind of feedback, whether it's an incentive program or it's an education program or what have you, to talk to real farmers on the ground. I have found that immensely useful, or I haven't necessarily used that in my role, but it has informed my understanding. And as legislators, we never have just one finger in one pie, right? So it's gathering all of this information to help us be better legislators. But one of my colleagues that I have met on the caucus has been working with PFAS, and many people on this call would be familiar with forever chemicals and their harm and the fact that they're everywhere. And she had worked on legislation and an initiative to protect firefighters, and it was about labeling firefighter gear, saying, basically this is harmful, and labeling it as with PFAS as a part of the push to get things changed, right? It's a detrimental label that is part of that story for making things better. And she has sent me that, and I have met with firefighters in Ontario to talk about what we're doing provincially. And while they're approaching it from a different angle, they've got that in their back pocket, potentially labeled back pocket as well. Sorry. But I would say the only other thing that I would add, on that, at the personal level, at one of the conferences, I had the opportunity to go with a counterpart from a different party, from Ontario, And I've never met him. I've never had the occasion to work with him. Certainly not to know him professionally. And it was really interesting that the partisan pieces don't really fit in the puzzle of Great Lakes protection, right? That we had a lot of things in common. I would say that, to lean into the puns, that we are rowing in the same direction. And so that's been an important piece as well as a professional. And obviously bigger picture pieces, ballast water and shipping, and having these conversations where I can come home and say, what are we doing about this? And is it as good as the States? Is it better than? How are we, sharing data? All of that. There have been a lot of opportunities to keep the work moving forward.
Laura, it might be just interesting for people. Take the example of the ban on small plastic bottles in hotels. And years ago, when a number of the hotel chains were all putting out their sustainability statements, my colleague Jill Geiger and I went to a couple of the sustainability coordinators and said, hey, instead of all these little plastic bottles, which many of us like to take home, wouldn't it be great if you shifted to bigger bottles and you reduce the waste stream? And I would have thought that over the years they'd sort of do it, but most of them haven't. So take your legislation, which is passed in Illinois, without asking any state secrets. How will you take that to the council here to try to gain more support in other places? What's sort of the process by which that happens? And how does that attract interest in some places or perhaps not in others? How does that work?
Question. So we have our annual meeting coming up in September. And at these meetings, we have the opportunity to sit down with people we know who share our interests, because you wouldn't be attending these meetings if you had no interest in the environment or the Great Lakes. And we have a roundtable that allows us to share these ideas. And what's really important in that sharing is not only can we, share the legislation, it's easy, you could read anything off a piece of paper, but we could also have that really in-depth discussion on how did you get to where you landed? Who did you work with? Who pushed back? Who was working with you? What challenges do you think that we might face if we introduce that legislation in our state or province? So this gives us the opportunity to have those conversations and to really take a deep dive into issues that, as Jennifer had mentioned, sometimes we're jack of all trade, master of none, because there are so many issues that are flying past us. But with this particular caucus, we have the opportunity to really delve into these issues and what are the problems and what are the solutions? What are the pitfalls? What are we going to come up against? And the fact that these meetings are bipartisan is actually very helpful because it sort of gives you a preview of what is the other side of the equation? Who is going to push back? What are people going to feel? Like with the plastic bottles, interestingly enough, industry was on our side. We worked really closely with the hotel industry. They were wonderful partners in this legislation. However, I had people on the other side of the aisle for me claiming that this was going to hurt industry and industry is going to be opposed to it. So it's good for me to be able to share this with my colleagues that although there might be somebody in the legislature who might push back, that's not the experience that I had in working this legislation, that we were able to carry it through. So it kind of lets you share the secret sauce with people who might be interested. But sometimes there will be an idea that you learned from another state that got passed quite easily that is more of a challenge in your particular state, because different things might be in play that might not be in play in other states. But it's really, we have the good opportunity to dive into issues, to learn more about them with our Burkholz Institute, learning so much more about issues like lead pipes and how does that impact everybody. Flooding and coastal resiliency. Our Burkholz Institute had the opportunity to visit Detroit and find out what is really going on with flooding and what is the ripple effect of that. Not only the people who are flooded, but the homeowners, the insurance, what gets back into the water. So it gives us this opportunity to really take, like I said, an in-depth look, pardon the water pun, into everything going on.
I feel like I should say this. I had the honor and pleasure of working with State Senator Patty Burgos when, Patty served as a legislator. She was terrific to work with. She was a force of nature in terms of moving to get things done. She knew how to work across the aisle. And this program being one of her legacies. She has many legacies. It truly is wonderful. When you both talk about challenges, just an observation, and I grew up not far from Lake Michigan. Anybody who's grown up on the Great Lakes, to some degree, we look at all the challenges ahead. The amount of progress in cleaning up and restoring the Great Lakes has been terrific. Gone are the days of foamy waters laden with phosphorus rolling up on every beach. We have phosphorus problems, we have algae problems, but there's been a lot of progress. You both mentioned some of the challenges. Why don't you each just pick one? Let's start, Jennifer, with you. Just if you were going to spend the next couple of years in the caucus, next couple of years on one challenge, what would that be? Because I take, Laura, your point, or both of you have said it. You have many, many things on your platters. You can't do everything. So give us a sense of each of your priorities, the challenges that the caucus and all of us need to deal with.
So I reject the premise of the question. I don't know how to answer it with one, because one of the things, so the Burkholz Institute have been focused areas, the lead in drinking water, nutrient management, and then most recently, climate resiliency. And even that one area is interconnected, from wetland science and all that. So it's, I'm a Gemini, so I can't ever choose just one thing.
However, am I.
Yeah,
everything's hitched to everything else in the universe.
Well, and certainly anything to do with water quality in the Great Lakes, if we ever thought of it as not being interconnected, we wouldn't see those gains, and we certainly have a bright future. However, I take your point. So if I had
I bet you though, there's something that's sort of top of mind for you.
I think,
and you'd recognizing that everything's connected to everything else, you'd really like to be able to do more on.
So my problem is I would like to do all the things all at the same time. I think because I draw from my previous career as an educator, I would be very glad for governments at different levels and policymakers to recognize that we need to keep educating the broader public on, better choices or impacts of things. So whether that is, we're looking at PFAS and how we as consumers and neighbors are being impacted, and our choices have a, that broader impact. I think that's a piece of it. I think that the wake boats that are doing such unbelievable, shocking harm to the bed, as well as, the erosion impacts on the side. It's about our impacts, not only looking to government for solutions. We certainly have to work in partnership with the communities we serve, but also we have time to learn from, experts and folks about what's happening at the science level or the policy level. But the average, community member has a life to live, and they want to know that the lakes are well looked after, that they're safe, that they're clean, that they'll be there for future generations. So I think the education piece, whether it's learning about the next awful thing that's in the lake, whether it's PFAS, whether it's algae, whether it's all of that, it has to be education. So there's my one answer. That was hard.
All right. Fair enough. Laura, to you, and then we have some questions that people have been posting. I want to make sure that we can get to those.
So for me, I would have to agree with MPP French. One of my biggest pushes and issues are PFAS in our lakes and styrofoam. Those are, to me, go hand in hand because they are poison not only to our aquatic life, but to us as individuals. And so, with the support of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, we have started to make progress in Illinois, like banning firefighting foam with PFAS. I have another piece of legislation that I've been working on for a couple of years to eliminate certain products from the markets in Illinois so we can't get those chemicals into our water because we are just learning the dangers of these chemicals, and more people are finally becoming aware, because it's not like when you go to the lake and you go swimming, you see them or you smell them, but we know
Right.
they're there and we know the dangers that they are causing. And so for me, it's how do we work with experts to form legislation that we can pass that will ensure that our water stays healthy to consume and healthy for recreational purposes? Because not only is it there for our consumption, but it's there for our enjoyment. And it is a huge part of the economy in all the states and provinces that rely upon those lakes and those bodies of waters. So how can we make sure that we can preserve them for future generations, for hundreds of years?
There are a number of questions I'm going to try to put together for you. One of them is about education. A couple are about politics. You're both legislators, so I'll start with the politics. Alan Tonetti and Juan Pablo Ramirez Franco ask about what political challenges do you face in Canada and the US from the federal side of the government, from the Canadian Prime Minister, US President? How does that affect your work, good and bad? And Laura, with the DNC coming to Chicago in a few weeks, what do you think's at stake for the Great Lakes? Why don't we start with Jennifer and then Laura?
So much of the federal umbrella that we operate under is long-standing agreements. Some that Jess had mentioned at the beginning of this, right? That we have agreements with the states that scientists and bureaucrats and legislators maybe are working towards, and so those exist. And I think depending on, you guys say bipartisan. For us, we say nonpartisan because we have multiple parties.
Right.
But when you look to our politics, you for the most part see a back and forth, or historically, federally. And so if we see a regime shift with the next election, we may see a funding priorities shift. We may, and what that looks like, I think historically it makes a difference in terms of environmental spending or invasive species work or what have you. I have found it interesting, though, when it comes to the Great Lakes, everybody has a different reason for loving the Great Lakes. So this is when I had met some of the American counterparts that were really focused on water use, right? And industry opportunity, or it was looking at the real estate side of the Great Lakes, which, as a tree hugger, I kind of found that interesting, because the wetland science or whatnot, that was something I was interested in. Those two things can connect and you can have conversations. So the politics is navigable at the provincial and I would say at the state level. But I woke up this morning and saw that there are announcements about, our water testing for diseases and whatnot. There's just a change in policy provincially. So, there's constant political decisions being made that are short-term, either challenges or improvements. But the big picture stuff that's federal, that doesn't, I would say that hasn't affected me on a day-to-day or decision-making basis. it'll be interesting to see, as I said, politically, if there's a regime shift. I would say, though, that
Right.
there are the driving forces behind politics, though, right? Like one of the shipping conversations, I mentioned ballast water earlier, but shipping on the Great Lakes, the Lakers, these big, massive ships, the ballast systems are not the same. And we have differently and more stringent regulations in Canada than the states have been able to sort out, which means that there's not a financial incentive for those more stringent changes to happen stateside, and it's putting us at a disadvantage, financially. And why do I know this? Well, because the shipping industry is coming to me. So the politics of some of the environmental changes, that's where it gets quite interesting.
And Jennifer, you'll be pleased to know the Environmental Law and Policy Center is aligned with the Canadian government's position on the ballast water issues in the Lakers. We've said to both the US EPA and to maritime authorities in the states that the old boats, the Lakers as they're called, should not get a pass on installing modern pollution control technology to reduce invasives from coming in, and generally speaking have aligned fairly closely with the Canadian government's position. And I know the Canadian Consul General here in Chicago is quite pleased with the position we've taken. So score one for ELPC working closely with the Canadian government on that issue, or coming to the same conclusion as the Canadian government has gone. Laura, let's shift to you on the question of, going into the DNC, what's at stake for the Great Lakes, and how do the priorities of the president affect what you're trying to achieve through the caucus and protecting the Great Lakes?
So I'm going to try not to get political. I'll just use this as my opinion as a legislature. But if you care about clean water and the Great Lakes, we need to be paying attention right now. Project 2025, to me, it's frightening for all the progress that we've made. If we don't support the environment in our next election, we are going to bring ourselves backwards by decades and centuries. So we really have to pay attention to what's going on and what our potential federal candidates are saying about the environment, about our clean water supplies, about the electric grid, about clean energy, because this is something that we all as a state and as a country have been working forward for so many years, but we can backtrack so easily. And our Canadian counterparts will also be affected by what happens here in the United States. So we really need to be in tune with what's going on and pay attention, because there's a lot of reasons people need to go out to vote, but I think the environment should be top of mind. And you need to personally decide which direction you would like to go in. With states, because of some court rulings that we have had, we are rowing upstream, is that the proper terminology, to make sure that our states can have the proper policies in place without federal rulings really having a negative impact on what we're trying to accomplish. So paying attention to politics and to the federal government and to states' rights is very important.
Thank you. Let me turn to a question that fits, Jennifer, the education point you were making. This is from Michelle Higgins. She lives in Rogers Park, which is a neighborhood on the far north side of Chicago. I live not far from there. It's right on the Chicago-Evanston border, if that helps you, near Loyola University. It's been flooded a lot. And her question is, what can individuals do in terms of advocating for coastal resilience of the local areas where they live? She talks about living near the beach in Rogers Park, and she wants to be a voice for the beaches, but not sure how to go about doing that. And I'm sure this isn't obviously just a Rogers Park, Lake Michigan issue. It's the broader sort of education issue you're talking about. Do you want to share your thinking on that, both Jennifer and Laura?
Yes, I'm going to not answer her question initially, and then I'll get back to it. Some of what we have learned in terms of the flooding challenges when we've visited Detroit and stood, on the front porches of people who live with that unbelievable fear of the next rainfall, still live out of tote bins and are dealing with, the harms of FEMA or the various programs that fall short, and there's government decisions in what happens after a flood. But in terms of flood prevention, that's also, policy and government investment. So there were so many layers of complications that even when there was a great idea, we would see parking lots that were made kind of sloping down to a lower point, and underneath that was a huge bladder. It was called something else, but that would hold the water and then allow for slow release, and so mitigated the flooding, the flood harm at that time. Things like that, but they cost money, and it's not about political will necessarily. It's about money flowing. Those two things, of course, are interlinked, but also in being in communities where historically it's marginalized folks and the government says, trust us, get on a bus, we're going to move you. Communities will say nuts to you for, often good reason. And so it's about building community trust and having that input from the folks who are living there. We've seen in Quebec that the government had good success buying land that is in the floodplain back from people, giving them fair market, and those folks moved to the hills. But they were able to relocate whole populations and whole communities. Well, that's a big undertaking, and that may or may not be necessary. So I think that the community has to look around and say, what is needed, and really hold their elected officials to account to find out what are some of the infrastructure things that could make things better. That are, if there's an uphill battle and you're in a floodplain and the only way is out, then you have to have those very challenging conversations about who will fund that and organize that. So we also not having government policy that diminishes or destroys wetlands and those areas that help to mitigate flooding, right? Because if development is the goal, then without doing it thoughtfully or properly or with experts involved, we're going to continue to be in a worse mess. And so I think the folks in the community who see what's going on absolutely have to flood, pun intended, council meetings, and get the ear of decision makers and hold them accountable. Because I don't think it's super partisan. It feels partisan because of money and development and private interests and whatnot. But I think that's where it has to happen to have an impact.
Thank you. Laura, your thoughts on the public education side? And folks, we're going to move to wrap up after Laura's comment.
I agree. What many people have to remember is sometimes your elected official might not be working against you. They are just uneducated. And they need for you to come in, sit down, make that appointment, and educate them about what needs to be done. And this is it is far reaching because an elected position is not forever. So as soon as you finally make somebody understand and have somebody have the knowledge of an issue, it could be a different person who's in that seat. But we do have amazing organizations in our area that help with that. We have ELPC. We have the Illinois Environmental Council. We have the Sierra Club. We have so many incredible organizations when it comes to protecting our water. And for an individual who really wants to make an impact, I would say reach out to one of these organizations. Get involved, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. They've already invented that wheel. You just have to hop on that bus and start moving with them to make sure that your voice is heard and that others can learn. Because sometimes it's just ignorance, and we have to make sure that everybody is on the same page, because we all know that if we don't have that fresh water supply, we see what's going on in other parts of the country. We need to protect this, because really this is our future.
Thank you, both MPP French and Senator Fine, for your time with us today. Your comments were thoughtful, helpful. I regret we weren't able to get to all the questions that people posted in the Q&A, but we've tried to do our best. Even more importantly than the good comments you made today, thank you for the work you're doing through the caucus and in Parliament and in the legislature to protect and restore the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes is where we live, work, and play, and your work to help protect and restore them is just vital, not just for people today, but for our ecological and our environmental future. So thank you for what you're doing. And thank you to all of you who joined us today for this ELPC Thinks webinar. It will be posted online on Facebook. Feel free to take another look, share with your friends, and keep an eye out for future ELPC Thinks invites, okay? Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Jennifer and Laura, for what you do. Take care.
Thank you.